He turned off the kitchen light while I was still standing at the counter. I had been in the middle of making tea. My mug was already out, the kettle was on, and I had just opened the tin of chamomile I keep in the second cabinet from the left. The same place I have kept it for 31 years, since long before my son-in-law ever set foot in this house. He walked past me, reached up, and flicked the switch without a word. Just darkness. Then he went back down the hall. I stood there in my own kitchen in the dark. That was a Tuesday in February. That was the moment I understood that something had changed in a way I could no longer explain away or wait out or quietly absorb. I had been absorbing things for 3 years. I had gotten very good at it, but you cannot absorb darkness in your own kitchen at 8 o'clock in the evening and call it nothing. I should tell you about the house first. My husband Gerald and I bought it in 1991. It was a semi-detached on a quiet street in Oakville. Not a grand house, not anything that would make you slow down driving past it, but ours completely. Gerald refinished the floors in the living room himself, on his knees for an entire weekend, and I painted every room twice because the first colors were never quite right. We raised 2 children there. We shoveled that driveway for decades together. Gerald died in the spring of 2019, and after the funeral, after the people went home and the casserole dishes were returned and the sympathy cards stopped coming, I was left alone in a house I had shared with someone for 28 years. My daughter Sylvia suggested about 6 months after Gerald passed that she and her husband move in. Just for a while, she said. Things were tight. Her husband, I will call him my son-in-law throughout, because that is how I came to think of him, as a title rather than a person, had left his job in sales and was trying to start some kind of business. She was working part-time. They had some credit card debt. The numbers, she said, were just not working. I said yes because she was my daughter and because the house felt enormous in a way I had not expected. I said yes because Gerald would have said yes. I said yes because I was 63 and tired, and grief does something to your judgment, or at least it did to mine. It makes you want bodies in the rooms. It makes silence feel like a threat. I did not ask for rent. I want to be honest about that. I did not set a timeline in writing. I did not sit down with a lawyer and draw up a formal agreement. My daughter was not a stranger. I thought the ordinary rules of family would hold. They held for about 4 months. The first thing I noticed was the way he spoke to her in the kitchen when they thought I was upstairs. Not shouting, he was never a shouter, which somehow made it worse. A low, flattening tone, like someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. I heard it through the ceiling. I heard the way her voice would go small in response. I did not say anything because it was not my place, or so I told myself. Their marriage was their marriage. Then small things. My container of olive oil moved from where I always kept it by the stove to a shelf I could not comfortably reach. My reading chair, the wingback Gerald and I had found at an estate sale in Burlington, was shifted to the corner to make room for a gaming chair he had ordered online. I moved it back. 2 days later, it was in the corner again. I moved it back. It happened 4 times before I stopped moving it. I told myself these were small things. By the 2nd year, they had repainted the guest room, the room they were using, a dark charcoal gray without asking me. My son-in-law had hung a large television on the wall of the living room, drilled directly into the plaster, again without asking. When I mentioned it, he said it looked better. He said this the way you might say the sky is blue, factually, without discussion. My daughter said he meant well. I began to spend more time upstairs. I started taking my meals earlier so that I would be out of the kitchen before he came home. I rearranged my life around his comfort in my own house, and I did it so gradually that I did not notice I was doing it until the day my sister came to visit from Kingston. We were sitting in the living room, Patricia and I, having coffee. and my son-in-law came in and turned the television on at a volume that made conversation impossible. Patricia looked at me. I looked at my coffee cup. My sister said, "Lorraine, shall we go sit in the kitchen?" And I said yes. We shuffled into the kitchen, and she did not say a single word about it the whole visit. She just held my hand on the counter for a moment before she left and said quietly, "Call me." I did not call her. I should have. The end of the 3rd year was when things shifted again. The business my son-in-law had been building was not building. I do not know the details. Sylvia stopped sharing them, but I could read the temperature in the house. He was home more. He was on the phone a lot, behind the closed door of the bedroom. There was an edginess that had not been there before, a short fuse on everything, a way he had of walking through rooms like they owed him something. In November, he told Sylvia I needed to stop having my friend Bev over on Thursday afternoons because the noise was disruptive. I have been having Bev over on Thursday afternoons since her husband left her in 2017. We drink tea. We sometimes watch a show. We are 2 women in our 60s talking, which I do not believe has ever registered above a reasonable volume in the 31 years I have lived in this house. Sylvia passed this along to me the way she passed along most of his requests by then. Apologetically, not quite looking at me, with a kind of preemptive exhaustion in her face, as though she was already braced for my reaction. She said he was under a lot of pressure. She said just for a few weeks maybe. I told Bev on Thursday. Bev looked at me across the kitchen table and said in the plainest possible terms, "Lorraine, this is your house." I knew that. I had the deed, registered in my name and my name only, down at the registry office on Trafalgar Road. I had paid the property tax every year, including the last 3 years during which 2 adults had lived in my house and contributed nothing financially to its operation. I knew it was my house. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped living in it like it was. The night of the kitchen light was a Tuesday in February, as I said. The following Saturday, it happened. I was in the living room in the wingback chair. I had moved it back one final time and decided, quietly, that it was not moving again. I was watching the news. It was just before 6. My son-in-law came downstairs, stopped in the doorway, and looked at me. He said, "Can you take that upstairs? We want to watch something." I said, "I'm watching the news." He said, "We watch in here in the evenings. You know that." I did not know that, or rather, I had allowed it to become true through my own retreating, but it was not a rule I had agreed to. This was not his living room. The news had been on this television, on this channel, at this hour, since 1991. He said, "Come on, Lorraine, don't make it a whole thing." I looked at him for a moment. He was standing in my doorway in my house, telling me not to make a whole thing of sitting in my own chair watching my own television. My daughter was somewhere upstairs. She was always somewhere upstairs. I said, "I'll finish the news." He made a sound dismissive, just air through his nose, and said, quietly but clearly, "You're a guest in this house now. Act like it." Then he walked back upstairs. I sat there for a moment. The news anchor was talking about the weather. There was a low-pressure system moving in from Lake Ontario, possible freezing rain Thursday. I watched the forecast map and I thought, with the clarity I had not felt in a long time, No, I am not. I did not say anything that evening. I did not go upstairs and confront anyone. I finished the news. I washed my mug. I went to bed. In the morning, I called Patricia. She listened without interrupting, which is the thing I love most about my sister. When I finished, she said, "Do you want me to find you a name?" She had a colleague whose wife was a real estate lawyer. The wife, her name was Adeza, did not ordinarily handle residential tenancy matters, but she knew someone who did, and within a week I had an appointment with a paralegal named Thomas who worked out of an office above a dry cleaner on Lakeshore Road. I felt strange walking in there. I felt as though I was doing something aggressive, something that needed to be justified. Thomas must have seen that expression before. He just opened a folder and said, "Tell me the situation," and I told him. He asked whether there was a lease. I said no. He asked whether they had paid rent. I said no. He asked how long they had been in the property. I said 3 years and 2 months. He said, "They are not tenants in the legal sense, but under Ontario law, anyone who occupies a residence, even without a lease, even without paying rent, acquires certain rights after a period of time. We have to follow a process. It will take time, but you are the registered owner, and this is absolutely your right." I asked, "What does the process look like?" He said, "It starts with a formal written notice. We send it through proper channels. It states the date by which they are required to vacate, the reason, and the legal basis. It is not emotional. It is just paper." I said, "That's what I want, just paper. I want you to understand what that felt like. Not triumphant, not angry, just clarifying. For 3 years I had been trying to solve something with softness that required structure. I had been hoping that the people in my house would, on their own, develop the consideration and the gratitude and the basic decency that would make this livable. They had not, and I had kept hoping anyway, which is its own kind of failure, though I have been gentler with myself about it since. Thomas prepared the notice. I reviewed it. It was formal and exact and contained nothing personal, just the address, the date, the legal requirement to vacate within 60 days, and a reference to the Residential Tenancies Act as it applied to our situation. I signed it. He filed the necessary documentation. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I was upstairs. I heard Sylvia answer it. I heard a man's voice, professional even, unhurried, and the brief silence that followed, then the sound of the door closing. I waited. About 10 minutes later, my daughter knocked on my bedroom door. She came in and sat on the edge of the bed the way she used to when she was small and had done something wrong at school and was trying to figure out how to start. She was holding the papers. She said, "Mom, what is this?" I said, "It's a notice to vacate. You have 60 days. She said, "You can't be serious." I said, "I've been serious for quite some time. I just didn't have the right paperwork." There was a long silence. She looked down at the papers. I watched her read them again, more slowly. She said, "He's going to lose his mind." I said, "That's between you and him. I want to be fair to my daughter here because what happened next was not nothing." She did not storm out. She did not get up and go tell him immediately, the way I had half expected. She sat there for a while, and I watched something move across her face. Not quite shame, but something close to it. A reckoning of some kind. She said, "I knew it had gotten bad. I kept thinking it would settle." I said, "I kept thinking the same thing." She said, "He won't go easily." I said, "He doesn't have to go easily. He just has to go." My son-in-law did not take it quietly, it's true. There was a night, about a week after the notice, where I could hear him through the wall, his voice low and fast and furious. And I sat in my chair with my chamomile tea, and I listened, and I thought about the fact that Thomas had told me, specifically, that I was under no obligation to engage with any of it. That was the phrase he used. Under no obligation to engage. I have thought about that phrase many times since. I did not engage. He called my phone twice. I did not answer. He knocked on my bedroom door once, late on a Thursday evening, and I said through the door, "Please contact Thomas directly." And I gave him the name and number on a piece of paper slid under the door, and I went back to my chair. Sylvia was the harder part. She came to me about 3 weeks in and said she had found a place, a 2-bedroom in Mississauga, more than they could comfortably afford but manageable. She was going back to work full-time. She said it with a kind of dull determination that made me realize she had already made a decision about the marriage, or at least the beginning of one that had nothing to do with me. I did not push. I just said, "I'm glad you have a plan." She said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't say anything." I said, "You can say something from your own house. That's a good place to say things from." She looked at me for a moment and then she laughed, a small, exhausted laugh, and she leaned her head against my shoulder for just a second before she got up and went back down the hall. They were out on the 58th day. I walked through the house the evening after they left. Gerald's floors, which had developed a new scratch near the hallway that I did not remember being there before. The charcoal gray walls of the guest room, the hole in the plaster from the television bracket which would need to be filled and painted. The kitchen, smelling faintly of something unfamiliar, some cleaning product he had used that wasn't the one I kept under the sink. I put the kettle on. I found my chamomile tin in the second cabinet from the left, exactly where it belongs. I moved the wing-back chair back to its spot by the window, the worn spot on the armrest where my hand rests, where Gerald's hand rested before mine. I sat down. I called Patricia. I called Bev and told her Thursday was back on. She said she would bring the shortbread. The house was quiet. Not the held breath quiet of the past 3 years, where every sound was a small calculation. Is this too much? Am I in the way? Should I go upstairs? The quiet of a house that has stopped bracing itself. The ordinary quiet of an evening in a house on a street in Oakville, where a 66-year-old woman is allowed to finish watching the news. I have thought a lot, since then, about what I should have done differently. I should have had a written agreement at the beginning, a timeline, a contribution toward utilities at minimum, something on paper. Not because I distrusted my daughter, but because paper is not about trust. Paper is about clarity. Paper is kind, actually, when you think about it. It tells everyone where they stand before they've had a chance to forget. I should have moved the chair back the first time and said out loud, "This is my chair, in my house, and I would like it where I can see the window." I should have kept Thursday afternoons for Bev from the very beginning without apology. I should have understood much earlier that making yourself small inside your own home is not the same as being generous. But here's the thing I have stopped doing, and I would say this to anyone in a similar situation. I have stopped spending too much time in that backward-looking place, the what-ifs and the should-haves. I made the decisions I made with what I had at the time. Grief had taken the better part of my judgment for a while. That is not weakness. That is just loss, doing what loss does. What mattered was the piece of paper. What mattered was Thomas's office on Lakeshore Road and the phrase, "under no obligation to engage," and the knock on the door on a Wednesday afternoon. What mattered was knowing, really knowing, not just holding the deed in a drawer, that the house was mine. The shortbread was very good that first Thursday back. Bev stayed until almost 9, which is longer than usual. We watched half a documentary about the St. Lawrence River that neither of us ended up following very closely. The streetlight came through the window at the angle it always has since 1991, and I watched it fall across the floor that Gerald refinished on his knees one long weekend, and I thought, I am home. Not arriving home, not reclaiming it dramatically, just home. The simple, unremarkable, entirely sufficient fact of it. That is enough. It has always been enough. I keep coming back to the kitchen light. Such a small thing, a flick of a switch, a few seconds in the dark, and yet it was the moment everything became undeniable. Not because it was the worst thing that happened in those 3 years. It wasn't. But it was the clearest. There was no way to soften it, no generous interpretation available. He turned off the light while I was standing at my own counter, in my own kitchen, and he walked away. And I stood there and I let it happen. That is the part I have had to sit with, honestly. I did not lose my home because of my son-in-law's behavior. His behavior was what it was, a slow, deliberate expansion into whatever space I left unfilled. What I lost, temporarily, was my own willingness to hold the line. And those are two very different things to reckon with. One is about another person's character. The other is about mine. What I understand now is that kindness without clarity is not really kindness. It is just postponement. When I said yes to having them move in without any written agreement, without a timeline, without even a conversation about expectations, I told myself I was being generous. And in part, I was. But I was also avoiding discomfort, which is a different thing dressed in the same clothes. Real generosity is clear-eyed. It says, here is what I can offer, and here is what I need in return, and let us both understand that from the beginning. What I did instead was hand over something valuable and then hope, quietly, that no one would notice I had done it. The text reads taught me that moral character, the real kind, not the performed kind, shows up in the ordinary moments nobody is watching. It shows up in whether you move someone's chair back to the corner after they've moved it, or whether you don't. It shows up in a flick of a light switch at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday. My son-in-law revealed himself slowly, through small choices, and so did I. But here is what I also believe. It is never too late to act from a clearer place. The moment I sat across from Thomas in that office on Lakeshore Road and said, I want just paper, no confrontation, that was not defeat. That was intelligence applied to a problem I had been trying to solve with emotion for far too long. I had to understand the situation accurately before I could act on it usefully. Grief had clouded that for a while. Loss does that. It is not a character flaw, it is a human condition. But at some point the fog lifts and you are responsible for what you do with the clear air. And then there is what it took to actually follow through, to sign the document, to not answer the phone, to say, through a closed door, please contact Thomas directly and mean it. That steadiness, the kind that does not require an audience, that does not need to win an argument or have the last word, that is what carried me through. Not anger, not revenge. Just a quiet, persistent refusal to give up what was rightfully mine. I think about Bev sitting across from me that Thursday afternoon, saying simply, Lorraine, this is your house. She did not tell me what to do. She did not rescue me. She just said the true thing out loud, which was what I needed someone to do. Sometimes clarity comes from the outside first, and there is no shame in that. The shame would have been in not hearing it. The shortbread that first Thursday back tasted exactly the same as it always had. That is the thing about your own home. When you truly inhabit it, it holds the same. It was waiting. All it needed was for me to come back to it fully, which I finally did. You are allowed to ask for what is yours. You are allowed to do it quietly, without spectacle, without cruelty, with nothing but a piece of paper and the simple knowledge that you are standing on solid ground. That is enough. It has always been enough.